everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I am going to be doing my winter reading wrap-up. It's been interesting. I kind of got stalled in January. I technically read 2 books, but they led me into a weird little reading slump, which I am going to talk about. Then I broke out of the reading slump and I read a string of amazing 5-star thrillers. So we have a lot to talk about, mostly positive. And I will start with that book in January that kind of led me off the path, and I'll try to be as brief as humanly possible. I'm still debating about doing a whole video on it. Basically, I read a nonfiction book that totally ate my brain. So I watched Dirty John, which I hadn't seen yet. I marathoned it on Netflix, and I went on IMDb to look up an actor, and I saw that there were character names that I didn't recognize. And I was like, oh, what's this? They're going to do a 2nd season, and there's going to be a totally different true crime story. And it wasn't a true crime story that I had heard of, and it sent me down a rabbit hole, a wiki hole. And I was like, I want to know more about this. So off to Amazon I went, and lo and behold, there was a nonfiction book, all about it on Kindle Unlimited. So that book was called Until the 12th of Never, and it is about Betty Broderick. So Betty Broderick was a San Diego housewife in the 80s, very wealthy. Her husband was a very well-respected and high-powered lawyer, and they had essentially the messiest divorce in America, is what it was called at the time. And then after he had remarried his secretary, because you know how these things go, she murdered him and his new wife in their sleep. That is the very, very simplistic version of it. And the thing is, I can barely talk about it without going down a rabbit hole with a ton of detail. So the book that I read is from the 90s. It's by Bella Stumbo. So she was a LA Times reporter at the time. So the book, I believe, was released by a major publisher in like 1994. The murders happened in 89, and I believe she was convicted finally in 92 or 93. And like, apparently, I don't remember any of this because I was young enough that it just whoop went right over my head. It was apparently a really successful Lifetime movie starring Meredith Baxter, and like at the time everyone knew the story. Betty Broderick was on Oprah, and what's really fascinating about her, it's very reductive to say that someone is crazy, and so I won't. That's really the wrong word, because I actually think that does the whole story a disservice, and what made the book really, really interesting for me. So it is an incredibly thorough accounting by the journalist, and it must have gone out of print because it's been republished by a small publisher, and that's why it's on Kindle Unlimited. So when you look it up, it has a really tacky cover. I wasn't even sure if it was legit, but I did digging, and it was originally published, I believe possibly it was either HarperCollins or Simon & Schuster. It was one of the big ones in the 90s. It's a very thorough journalistic accounting of the entire story. It's a long book. I believe, I of course read on Kindle, but I think it's like 500 pages. It took me a solid week and a half of daily reading to get through this book. It was really intense. It was really engrossing, but it was also very upsetting. It ate my brain, basically. And if you watched my reading vlog, you know that I say in there, I filmed all of this reading vlog footage about reading this book, and I threw it all out and started over on my February reading vlog because this book ate my brain. In a good and a bad way. You're going to see parts of this experience come out in my thriller writing eventually, but I basically had to take a break. You're like, what is all this preamble? Long story short, I gave the book 4 stars, and I do kind of recommend it, but Betty Broderick very obviously suffers from intense personality disorders. I really like personality disorders, like from like a fascinated point of view. Don't really want to tussle with any people with them. And that's the thing, many, not all, but many personality disorders are incredibly destructive, and in the most extreme of cases, something like this can happen. A woman scorned, a woman who built her entire ego and self-image off of being the wife of a high-powered lawyer who she helped put through both med school and law school. She was the perfect mother, I'm putting that in quotes for a reason. They had 4 kids. That self-image was so important to her ego as someone who quite clearly has a narcissistic personality disorder She was also diagnosed with histrionic personality disorder, possibly borderline, but I actually would argue, having read the account, and just if you view it through the lens of that she might also have antisocial personality disorder, I feel like between narcissism and antisocial personality disorder, it explains so much about her. But when you view it through the lens of her personality disorders, the one that we can definitely say she has officially through diagnosis would be narcissistic personality disorder and histrionic. It explains everything. And essentially her ego fractured when Dan, her husband, dared to cheat on her with his secretary, much younger secretary, and file for divorce. How dare he? I think no matter what happened, and it was an ugly divorce, I think she was always going to kill him, and that is absolutely terrible, and I think he knew it. And there are haunting quotes in the book where he had said to friends of his that he assumed that she was just going to kill him eventually. It's insane. And I'm not even going into details. He announces their divorce, and to punish him and to try to force him to come back, she literally abandons all 4 of her children at his house and is like, I literally don't want the kids anymore. But then for the next 5-6 years is like, I want my kids back, but literally takes no steps to get her kids back. But it's part of the image of, I am the perfect mother, he's done this to me. And then she gets very upset when he actually adequately parents her children, and she loses that leverage, and he doesn't take it back for the divorce. And so she starts to leave these insane voicemail messages on his machine at the house where her kids are. I won't repeat any of the language, but you can look up transcripts where she basically, the secretary who is now in a relationship with him and living with him and eventually becomes his wife, she calls her the C word at all times, or the whore, and calls him an asshole, and then some other words that are more colorful that I won't say on video, and basically leaves these messages saying like, hey, expletive, how's expletive? You expletive, expletive, expletive. But then transitions into talking to her kids. Her like 7, 11, 17, and 18-year-old hear these obscene messages, hundreds and hundreds of them over the course of like 4 to 5 years. Obviously the kids get older. And then eventually she murders both the husband, the ex-husband, and the new wife, making her kids essentially orphans, because then she goes to jail. And it's even more intense than that. And I'm eating up too much time. The long story short is, it is a very, very intense nonfiction book. I was obviously engrossed and horrified. And the Dirty John season is going to be amazing. I think it's even crazier than the Dirty John story, which I didn't think was possible. So I fell down this rabbit hole of Betty Broderick, this true crime thing from the late 80s and early 90s. And it is the most fascinating and intense and in-depth portrait I've seen of a female, specifically female narcissist, because the way that she snapped, I will say, is very gendered. Kind of the way that she built up her ego is indeed very gendered. And my suspicion that she likely also has antisocial personality disorder, i.e. is sociopathic. When you read it through the lens of that, it is so fascinating and so instructive. I'm gonna put it in a book. 100%. But what was frustrating about the book, as detailed as it was, it's very obvious that the journalist who wrote this in the early 90s essentially was almost on Betty's side. This is someone, and it was the early 90s, I don't think we had as clear of an understanding of some of these personality disorders and how they manifest. And Betty basically claimed that Dan was such a horrible person and the divorce was so ugly because he was a high-powered lawyer that he drove her crazy and he made her do it. Yet at the same time, this woman, now we have 30 years of hindsight, she shows no remorse and has never shown remorse. And it wasn't just a blip of that she lost her mind. She has a raging set of personality disorders and literally has no ethics, does not know right from wrong, and has done horrible things to her children as well. She was not the perfect mom. The thing that I did after I read this book, meandering, I read an unauthorized biography of her daughter. Her daughter wrote a book and then changed her mind about it, but I found it. I'm a terrible person. Anyway, I read it and it was actually really illuminating because it's incredibly clear that perfect mom Betty Broderick was actually an abusive mom, and it all fits. But the thing is, the journalist Bella Stumbo, who wrote the account, believes a lot of what Betty told her in interviews in jail at face value. She reiterates that she was a perfect mom and like really fluffs her up. She victim blames. She basically says that Dan and Linda, that's the woman he married who also died, were horrible cheaters who were like awful and they got what came to them. She doesn't quite say it like that, but she kind of does, because she believes Betty's insanity defense, basically, and really kind of poo-poos the personality disorder thing. Whereas I buy the personality disorder thing. I believe the experts who diagnosed her on the stand. Like, because it is a good journalistic accounting, Bella does include stuff from therapists that she had and lawyers that she worked with. Like, the facts are there. It's all about the lens through which you view the story. And at times the author, I feel, demonstrates too much bias in favor of Betty Broderick. Again, I'm reading this with the benefit of hindsight. Like, we know for a fact she's been denied parole because she literally regrets nothing. She's a cold-blooded murderer. So that was my January. I gave it 4 stars because of the bias that was demonstrated by the journalist every once in a while. And the journalist is no longer living. Like, there's nothing we can do about it. This is a piece of work that exists from the early 90s, and it is what it is, and I read it. And if you also want to read something absolutely bonkers, I do recommend it. It broke my brain, however. And so how did I get out of essentially a tiny reading slump? I read a memoir. So the next book that I read is Scrappy Little Nobody by Anna Kendrick, and it was a really nice palate cleanser because I basically spent 2.5 weeks unable to read anything else. I kept watching YouTube videos about Betty Broderick. There aren't many. I've considered filming one, as I mentioned, and I haven't. It's a lot. Anyway, Scrappy Little Nobody by Anna Kendrick. She is, of course, an actress and a musical performer. She's been on my radar since Camp. I'm one of the few humans who has seen the movie Camp. It's kind of a cult classic, and she does talk about it in the book. And Anna is fascinating because I think she was the second youngest performer to ever be nominated for a Tony. She's really, really talented. And it's basically just a bog standard Hollywood memoir. She talks about her childhood, getting into acting, doing Broadway at age 12, you know, her first couple of movies, all the way up to where she is now. This was published a few years ago, so she had done Pitch Perfect, but she hadn't really blown up in the way that she has since. And it's just kind of very basic. I gave it 4 stars because it was incredibly enjoyable. More enjoyable than some of the celebrity memoirs I read in the fall. There were times when the narrative was a little bit twee, and Anna did a bit of Not Like Other Girls once or twice, just acting like she was such a nerd, such an outcast, but she was like drinking and partying and doing drugs, and she got her first boyfriend when she was like 19, which is perfectly normal. So there were moments where I was like, you're trying a little too hard to be different, Anna, but regardless, I did really enjoy the memoir. I don't mean to rag on that. I found it amusing more that Anna thought that she was this underdog character, whereas like, you sound really normal. Congratulations. Also, you were always really pretty. So yeah, really solid celebrity memoir. Had some like good stuff in it. I liked some of the behind the scenes stuff. She told 1 or 2 stories, but is clearly saving her best gossip for later, probably when people the gossip is about are gone. But it was basically the perfect palate cleanser, and it got me back into my thrillers, because in the meantime, it's like in January, every single publisher decided to approve titles on NetGalley, and I ended up having like 10, at least 10, but it could have been as high as 15. I got a whole bunch of books approved. I've now burned through some of them. We're talking about them, more to go. I had an amazing streak of thrillers after this. So the first one that I read is All the Pretty Things by Emily Arsenault. That is now out. It is basically, I'd call it more of a suspense than a thriller. It had kind of a slice of life, slow burn quality to it, and it definitely leaned more heavily on the contemporary YA side, so thus it will appeal to fans of not quiet contemporary YA, but kind of thoughtful, borderline literary, but not quite YA, character-driven YA contemporary with a suspense twist. It's about a girl, Ivy, whose dad runs an amusement park in New Hampshire called Fabuland, and she's visiting her grandmother for the summer, and while she is away, an employee at the amusement park dies tragically, and it's Ivy's best friend, Morgan, who finds the body. Ivy returns a day later. Morgan is missing. They do find Morgan, but she's catatonic at the top of the Ferris wheel and refuses to come down, and Ivy is the only person who can talk her down. But while she's up there, she says, "Morgan, what's wrong?" And Morgan answers, "Ask Ethan." And Ethan is the boy who died. So Morgan goes into the hospital for psychiatric evaluation because she's essentially suffering PTSD. And this launches Ivy into an investigation. She's determined to find out what happened to Ethan while she was gone, why Morgan said that. It's a little slow at first. I'd say the first 50%, the first half of the book, is a slow burn. It's not completely obvious where things are going. Like, you know that she's investigating, trying to find out what happened to Ethan because she wasn't there and impacts her friend. But then stuff happens around the middle that really kicks the story into gear. Everything starts going a bit faster, things come together, and I really enjoyed the read. Especially because I like the slice of life quality. I like incredibly specific settings that add a flavor to the proceedings, and the entire book is set at a rinky-dink amusement park. And I liked all the little details, like how Ivy works the cotton candy booth, and there's a whole like clue thread of like why Morgan, who's afraid of water, was lifeguarding that summer, and her putting together these pieces of what was going on at the amusement park in the 2 weeks that she was away that led up to this employee's death. Ultimately, I gave it 4 stars. As I mentioned, this is going to be an ideal suspense read for fans of character-driven slice of life YA contemporary. It's not so much a fast-paced, twisty thriller, but it was a very satisfying character-driven suspense. Next, I started my streak of 5-star thriller reads, starting with The Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. I'm almost late to the party filming this video now, but I picked it up the week after it came out and ended up on the New York Times bestseller list. I already had it from NetGalley. I was like, well, I gotta check this out, and it was the best YA thriller I have read since the last time I read a Kara Thomas novel, basically. If you love Kara Thomas books, you need to pick up The Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. I think she's a new name in YA thrillers. I was both impressed and intimidated. It was so good. Super voicey, major page turner. It was honestly a YA serial, except I liked the way that she took the aspects of the real life serial, the actual murder that podcast followed, and tweaked them for the story. I was really engrossed. I was constantly guessing. There were twists upon twists upon twists. All of the clues were so beautifully built, and it had such a satisfying ending. I mean, it was a home run thriller for me. 5 stars, highly recommend. Seriously, if you like thrillers, if you like YA thrillers, you need to pick up the book. Then, continuing on my streak, I picked up The Night Swim by Megan Golden. Megan Golden wrote one of my favorite thrillers of 2019, adult thrillers, The Escape Room, so I went in cautiously optimistic, knowing I'm probably gonna like this. And I'm happy to say that having finished it, it was a 5-star read, and Megan Golden is officially an auto-buy adult thriller author for me. She nailed it. And what she did that I loved about her first book that is also working in this one, the worlds are very intricate, deep, and specific in her books. The world around which she constructs a thriller, where you are just as fascinated and satisfied by the mechanics of the world that she builds as you are with all the thriller elements. They work together in concert. In The Escape Room, it was high stakes finance in New York City, and in The Night Swim, it's totally different. It's basically rape culture in a small town. That is the unifying theme of the book. It's rape culture. So in The Night Swim, Rachel is a successful podcast host. Her podcast, Guilty or Not Guilty, blew up. It's basically your Serial stand-in, and she is recording season 3 of her podcast in a small town in North Carolina where there is a very buzzy rape trial where a hotshot swimmer with Olympic aspirations allegedly raped a teenage girl. It has torn the town apart, and she's decided for this season, instead of investigating a cold case murder, to do a live as it's going rape trial as an exploration of rape culture. When she arrives, she gets a mysterious letter on her windshield from Hannah. Hannah claims that her sister Jenny was murdered in the same town 30 years ago. She said she's reached out to the podcast and they ignored her, and she is begging Rachel to look into her sister's murder. So those are basically your two POVs. It's letters from Hannah that she's consistently leaving for Rachel throughout the book. So when Rachel gets a letter, you get a POV chapter of Hannah's telling her sister's story from 30 years ago. Then you get Rachel's POV as the rape trial goes forward and she's poking into things. And then you get excerpts from her podcast that kind of give you more details about the present rape trial, case, town, etc. So if you're familiar with small town secrets tropes, you know where the book is going, and it delighted me to no end. And that is, of course, you start to realize as you're reading Hannah's letters to Rachel that there are aspects of what happened 30 years ago to her sister that must tie into the current rape case. It is well done, it's subtly done, I'm gonna spoil nothing, but I love those kinds of reads where you're playing detective. In the present tense chapters, you're trying to figure out, ooh, are any of these characters the unnamed people in the past? I love that stuff. I love it. So I adored this book, I flew through it, I had a lot of feelings, so this is my kind of trigger warning. I will say, because the world of the book is literally rape culture, that it's going to sit different ways with different readers. I don't have a problem making myself uncomfortable when it comes to that stuff. I am okay kind of sitting in... I got angry, to be honest. I got angry, I got frustrated, I was rooting for certain people and angry at other people, and the book really shows both sides in the sense that, obviously we are on the side of rape victims, but it shows how complicated things are, how different people are going to have different reactions, and very often the victim ends up being re-victimized. It covers all of those things. And so it's going to bring up a lot of emotions, and it is possible, if this is a trigger point for you, that this book is just not going to work for you. Nothing is graphically described in terms of actual assault. However, what is graphic is the emotions. What is described is the helplessness of the characters, the terror that they feel. And it can be a lot. So just bear that in mind. But if you are up for that kind of read, so far this is the best adult thriller I have read that essentially handles Me Too. I kind of hate throwing out that word. It sounds very, very gimmicky, but it's true. I thought it handled it really brilliantly. And it is wrapped around a really solid thriller with some good twists. Next, I read The Guest List by Lucy Foley. I gave this one 4.5 stars, but I rounded it up to 5, and it still counts as my streak because I had a really good time reading it. Because this one, again, it just hits the tropes I like. We've got an isolated island where there's an exclusive wedding. It's multi-POV. We have a very colorful cast of characters with both people you like and people you really hate, and you know that everyone has a secret and there are ways that they're connected that aren't immediately clear. And you also get the frame device where the book starts off with a third-person chapter of someone died. You know that there's a waitress screaming and there's a body, and then you get that interspersed throughout the narrative while you're getting the past working up to that point in other people's POVs. So it's the day before the wedding, and then you know that at the wedding something bad happens. It's that structure. And I devoured it. It did have a slightly slow start, just in that the first couple of POVs I had to kind of sink into the voice and the rhythm, but once I got a little bit further and got to some POVs that I liked a little more, to be honest, it's a good thing that the POVs are super distinct. They each feel like very specific kinds of people, and you know exactly who you're reading when you get into a chapter, which is really hard to do with 5 POVs. But some of them I liked more than others. So once I got into it though, and I started to see all the secrets threads and the things people were keeping from each other, I devoured it. I think in a day, it was no more than 2 days. It had some really good twists. It packed a punch. The only reason it's a 4.5, and I have to just kind of frown at it a tiny bit, is it had abrupt ending syndrome. It ended far too abruptly. I did the thing where I swiped to the next page, it said the end, and I was like, F you. Went back to double check I wasn't crazy. Yes, the book ended. it needed a good 2 to 3 chapters, 10 to 15 pages to settle in because it has such an explosive ending. I was so worked up in my emotions and these characters and what was happening to them that I needed a little more resolution from it. But regardless, if you like these tropes as much as I do, it's a home run read for it, and it has one of my favorite tropes that I will not say because of spoilers, which is a theme. There's another book I read that has the same trope that I love, and it does it very, very well, but it is definitely a spoiler. I wish I could say. I'll just say this is a British thriller, and there are people in this British thriller who went to boarding school. Read it. I did enjoy it. Next, I read something a little bit different. It was The Last Flight by Julie Clark. I would call this one almost upmarket suspense. It has an almost women's fiction-y feel in that you have 2 POVs. Both are women on the run who have gotten in too deep in their personal situations. And it's definitely a novel about their kind of personal journey and growth, but it's wrapped up in a suspense thriller plot. So you basically have Claire, who is the wife of a wannabe senator. He comes from an old famous family. He's compared in the book to JFK Jr., essentially the Kennedys. But secretly behind closed doors, he is an abusive husband. Claire really wants to get out, and she's been working on a plan to leave her husband. Meanwhile, you have Ava, and we as the reader, we only know that Ava is also on the run, but we don't know why. There's a reason for that. But essentially, they cross paths at the airport when Claire's entire plan has blown up. Her husband changes things on her last minute, and she can no longer go through with her escape plan as planned. She's booked on a flight to Puerto Rico instead of to Detroit, where she was supposed to go. And so when the stranger approaches her in the airport and is like, "We're both running from something," Ava says, "My husband died. I did, kind of ethical euthanasia, and now his family is after me." Claire believes this. They switch tickets. So Ava gets on the flight to Puerto Rico, and Claire gets on Ava's flight back to Oakland. And then the flight to Puerto Rico that Ava is on crashes. So Claire ends up trapped in Oakland. She has very little cash. She's living in Ava's house, but essentially inserting herself into Ava's life. And her face is all over the news because she is the most famous passenger, people think, on this flight that has crashed. And she realizes it's just a matter of time if they are able to recover bodies that her husband realizes she didn't actually die. But she also realizes as she lives in Ava's house and kind of lives her life that Ava wasn't fleeing for the reasons that she said she was. So you get Claire's POV going forward from the crash, and you get Ava's POV 6 months in the past, coming up to the day that they switched tickets to find out what Ava's secrets were and what new danger Claire is in living Ava's life. And so it goes back and forth. There are also hints that Ava might not have gotten on the flight after all. She was a con woman and she was on the run. I really liked The Last Flight. I gave it 5 stars because it delivered just enough suspense, like kind of, what is Claire gonna do? Is Claire gonna be safe? And that's the thing, I really cared about Claire. And honestly, I really cared about Ava. Her flashback chapters, kind of finding out about her life and how she ended up in such a horrible position, I cared about her. I found both of them really, really relatable. The book definitely has, this is another thing I like, which probably helped, explorations of class. It's basically both of them were women who came from kind of down on their luck positions and ended up in very privileged positions, but then kind of the positions they were in turned on a dime and became things that could potentially hurt them. And it contrasts kind of these women who came from nothing to have something and then to lose it all again kind of aspect. I wanted both of them to be okay. I was just really emotionally invested. It had some good twists, as in a good thriller. I guessed some of them, I nailed 1 or 2 of them, and then there were some that hit me out of nowhere. That's exactly the way a good thriller should be. There should be sleight of hand where I am convinced I know everything and then I don't. So The Last Flight had a couple of really good ones for that, and it had a really good, emotional, satisfying ending. Satisfying is actually a really interesting word. I was emotionally satisfied reading it, but it's not all sunshine and roses. It had some really good twists that I really enjoyed. And last but definitely not least, I finished the month out on His and Hers by Alice Feeney. I was so privileged to get an ARC of this, a physical ARC. The publisher sent it to me in the mail and I devoured it. So as you might know, Sometimes I Lie by Alice Feeney, which was her debut, featured heavily in my December reading vlog and my wrap-up, where I was very conflicted about that book. I gave it 4 stars, but what I wasn't sure about was whether it was actually 5 stars because it was a masterclass, or if it was too much and it was maybe lower stars, and I just wasn't sure if I liked it. It's a very polarizing book. Ultimately, I think I liked it because it's really stuck with me, and I knew that I liked Alice Feeney's writing. His and Hers was far less divisive. I flat out loved it, and I gave it 5 stars, because this is what His and Hers is. Well, first of all, it's soapy as heck. So is Sometimes I Lie, but this is soapy in a slightly different way. It has a serial killer storyline, like a serial killer trope, like ritualistic murders of people who are all connected by a single thing, one of those things. So it gives the narrative this ticking clock, because you're like, oh, I think that person's next. And you know that the main female character, Anna, there's a target on her back, but you're also questioning whether she's the killer. It's one of those really good ones. And that's the thing. The book is all about perspective, which is why it's called His and Hers. So Anna is our female main character, so her chapters are labeled her. She's a BBC journalist and a functioning alcoholic, and she is sent to cover this murder case in her former hometown, and it is someone that she knows from school who has been brutally murdered, and Anna is of course keeping secrets about her connection because she wants to make a name for herself on TV. The case is being investigated by her ex-husband, Jack. Their marriage ended quite messily a few years ago when they tragically lost their baby girl, which is why Anna's an alcoholic and Jack is making poor life choices, which also complicates the murder investigation. You can probably guess where this is going. Let's just say both His and Hers have a relationship with the deceased, and they are entangled in what's going on, and you're also getting interspersed POV from the killer. And you know it's the killer, and it has this very ominous tone. It's very serial killer-y. It's like, I had to kill them, that kind of thing, except you don't know who it is. And there are hints in it that could tie to a lot of different characters. I was having so much fun guessing. I was asking, especially because the last book she wrote was Sometimes I Lie. I was wondering, is Anna lying in her POV? Is Jack lying in his POV? Both of them have really questionable evidence that ends up in their possession. Are they being framed or are they guilty? Then there were lots of side characters who I was also questioning. There's a detective character who works with Jack and she's really shady. There's Jack's sister who knew all of them at school and something's wrong with her. I was just really on top of it. And that's the thing. I was quite pleased to guess the major twist in the book. I felt so good about myself. But then there were other things that I didn't guess, and that is, for me, what I love in a good thriller. There should be threads that I can latch onto and figure out, and then there should be threads that I am basically, you trick me as a reader. And that's where you get the adrenaline rush and the fun of reading it. So His and Hers was ultimately really, really satisfying for me. I got really into the characters. Several of them are deeply unlikable. Like there's a lot of conflict there. There were things that I was guessing at, things I got right, things I got wrong, and it had a big splashy ending, but also that proper resolution, which is really, really important. I really, really liked it. If you liked Sometimes I Lie, I highly recommend you pick it up because I think you will love this. And if you weren't sure about Sometimes I Lie, I still recommend you pick this up because I will say it doesn't have an ambiguous ending like Sometimes I Lie did. And that was one of the things on Sometimes I Lie where I was kind of on the fence because I wasn't sure if the ambiguous ending was brilliant or a cop-out. That was basically my problem. And this doesn't have any of that. Things resolve. It's good. And most of all, I really want to see it on television. So apparently Sometimes I Lie is going to be on Fox with Sarah Michelle Gellar, which is really cool. I think it's going to make a great TV show. But His and Hers really needs to be a soapy British procedural. It is made for it, and I really hope it happens. So yeah, I had a weird January and then I broke my streak and I had an amazing string of thrillers that I read, and I've been reading them as I've been revising them. They've been helping me revise, keeping me excited, keeping me on track in kind of thriller land. And I'm not stopping. My NetGalley queue still has an obscene number of really good looking books on it. So stay tuned. I'm gonna keep going. I don't usually mention this in my videos, but hey, follow me on Goodreads. I'll put a link down below. I review all of these books as I read them, so you can get a little sneak peek of what I am reading. And I do often go into more details, including spoilers under tags in my Goodreads reviews. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. Even if you don't, I'm going to continue to make reading wrap-ups. I know book fam are the only fam who makes it this far in the videos anyway. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week, and you get the bookish content 2 to 3 times a month. As always, thank you so much for watching, and happy reading.